Hello and welcome. And today's topic is demystifying the FDA's human factors guidance. My name is John Spear, and I'm the founder and VP of Quality and Regulatory here at Greenlight Guru and the moderator for today's event. We've got a really fantastic presentation scheduled for you today. I know our presenter, Bryant Foster, is really looking forward to sharing with you his insights and experience with human factors. Before we dive too deep in today's presentation and introduce our presenter and his consultancy research collective, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. First, today's webinar is going to run for about 60 minutes in total, and we'll include a Q&A session at the end where Bryant has been kind enough to answer many of the questions that you'll be submitting here in a few moments. So I encourage you to do so, to submit your questions throughout the webinar as they come up in the box on the right-hand side. And we will get to many of those as time permits. Another question that many of you are going to have, I'll try to answer this one right out of the gate. Yes, today's session is being recorded. Yes, you will get a copy of the recording and the slides after today's presentation, and it should come into your inbox right where all your other email lands, probably before the end of the day today. Second, I want to share with you a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've been on one of our training sessions and webinars before, then you know that we do this because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. And it's likely similar to the types of missions that each of you have at your medical device companies. Anything that Greenlight Guru can do as an organization that helps you bring medical products to market faster, life-changing device to market quicker with less risk. Frankly, it just aligns with our mission as a company. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether it's through hosting these free training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultants like Research Collective, or through our award-winning eQMS software platform. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies all over the globe in more than 500 cities from over 30 countries are ditching their broken paper-based quality systems and outdated legacy software for a new modern quality management system platform designed exclusively from the ground up for medical device companies, I encourage you to head over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation and press that big blue button to request your free personalized one-on-one demo. In it, you'll learn how the very best modern medical device companies are leveraging the Greenlight Guru eQMS software to breeze through audits, get products to market faster, reduce risk, and even more. So like I said, if you're interested in learning how we might be able to help your device company, be sure to go over to www.greenlight.guru after today's session and schedule your personalized demo. Okay, so let's get on to the bulk of today's presentation. I want to give a proper introduction to your presenter today and a partner of ours here at Greenlight Guru, Bryant Foster. Bryant is the Vice President of Research and Design at Research Collective. He guides human factors efforts for medical device manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, automakers, consumer product manufacturers, and more. His healthcare experience includes a wide range of products, including things like surgical instruments, diagnostic equipment, combination products, pump programmers, artificial organs, home use devices, and over-the-counter products. He has also led research and design efforts for in-car infotainment systems, automated driverless systems, and audio-visual navigation tools. As a UX researcher at Google X, Bryant performed research for products like Google Glass and Project Loom. He has a bachelor's degree in Spanish and a master's degree in applied psychology with human factors as an emphasis, both from Arizona State University. Go Sun Devils. And I can tell you that I've had a chance to talk and work with Bryant and his team at Research Collective quite a few times, and I have found their approach to human factors very, very refreshing, and I hope that you do as well. So without further ado, let me hand it over to our presenter, Bryant Foster.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, John. I'm definitely excited to present this topic today, something that I'm dealing with daily, and so It's really kind of what I live for. So some of you maybe, I'm guessing there's at least one of you that is learning for the first time that there's actually a degree in human factors. There is, and I found it luckily after, kind of circling through Spanish, which really has nothing to do with this field, but then found human factors and knew immediately that that's what I wanted to spend my life doing. One other piece of work history that I have is with the Agilist Consulting Group. They're also a medical device human factors company. I got a lot of experience working with them, so I want to give them credit where it's due. So as John mentioned, the goal of today's webinar is to talk about demystifying the FDA human factors guidelines. And in order to do that, kind of what I'd like to do is start with kind of a brief introduction to human factors, kind of how it got its start, what are some kind of seminal case studies, and then I'm going to try to clarify some commonly interchanged terms like human factors, usability, ergonomics. A lot of these things get kind of thrown around, and so I want to try to clarify those. And then I'll talk about how FDA began asking manufacturers to incorporate human factors into the design of medical devices and provide a systematic approach to complying with the current guidelines. Lastly, I'll touch briefly on some strategies for monitoring device usability through post-market surveillance. So about human factors applies knowledge from all human sciences to improve the match between people and their products. And products is a general way of saying anything that people interact with. So this includes things like the new phone in your pocket, the audio controls in your car's steering wheel, the process of ordering a burrito at Chipotle. All these things involve people dealing with some sort of situation, environment, process, or product. And in medical devices, of course, this pertains to things like all sorts of things, auto injectors, the surgical suite that is used for robotic surgery, the surgical systems and instruments themselves. And so there's always, at the end of the day, there's a user for each of these things. And so as human factors specialists, we take responsibility for ensuring that the products are designed with that end user in mind, taking into account the user's behavior, their capabilities, and even their limitations. Just want to say that human factors is not just simply applying a checklist of guidelines or using oneself as a model for designing things. So Alphonse Chapanis, considered to be the father of human factors, coined this phrase that I like quite a bit. He said, "It's easy to make things hard, but it's hard to make things easy. Good design takes some effort." So before going on, I want to clarify some of the terms that are commonly used as synonyms. So human factors and ergonomics can be used synonymously. They both refer to the practice of designing products, systems, and processes to involve or to improve the interaction between them and the people who use them. In the United States, human factors tends to be the term used most frequently, whereas ergonomics is used in many parts of Europe. But for the most part, these can be used interchangeably. Usability testing is a method within human factors that's used to evaluate a product's usability. Simple enough. But then within usability testing, there are two main types. The first one I'll talk about is formative usability testing. And the purpose of formative usability testing is to evaluate a product during the development process to ensure its design elements meet users' expectations and even identify opportunities for improvement. The other type is validation testing, validation usability testing, and it's intended to confirm or validate that the product can be used for medical devices, that it can be used safely and effectively by representative users. So validation testing is often also called summative testing. So to confuse things even more, there's two different ways of referring to this final validation or summative test that is where we are confirming that the device can be used by its users. But in the human factors guidance released by FDA in 2016, they use validation usability testing. And so that's what I'll use throughout this presentation. I'll talk more about these specific methods in more detail later on. So continuing on with a little background of human factors, it's based on Murphy's Law that says that anything that can go wrong will. So things should be designed for the least competent user in the most complicated situation. Some famous kind of origins, this one is kind of probably the most famous, but in 1943, our friend that we talked about earlier, Alphonse Chapanis, was called on to figure out why pilots and co-pilots of certain planes, specifically the P-47, B-17s, and B-25s, what they did was they retracted the wheels instead of the flaps after landing. You can imagine what that does to the plane. You're on the ground, you retract the wheels, and now the plane is on the ground. So Chapanis noticed that the side-by-side wheel and flap controls in most cases were identical toggle switches or nearly identical levers. And the pilots could easily confuse these. So he noted that the corresponding controls in different planes, like the C-47, for example, they weren't adjacent, and their methods of actuation were quite different. And the C-47 pilots never had this problem of pulling up the wheels after landing. So Chapanis realized these really were cockpit design errors, and that by coding the shapes and modes of operation, the problem could be solved. So as an immediate wartime fix, he took a small rubber wheel and attached it to the end of the wheel control, and he took a small wedge-shaped end and he put that on the flap control. And this modification stopped the pilots or allowed them to understand what each lever did, and they actually had less cases where the wheels were being retracted. So when the war was over, these mnemonically shape-coded wheel and flap controls were standardized worldwide. In healthcare, this is a sad story. Robin Rogers was 35 weeks pregnant and was vomiting and losing weight. So her doctor hospitalized her and ordered that she be fed through a tube until the birth of her daughter. The hospital, or the person taking care of her, mixed up two tubes, and instead of snaking a tube through her nose and into her stomach, the nurse coupled the liquid food bag to a tube that entered a vein. This is basically like pouring concrete down a drain. She and her baby died. And in something like this, it's really easy to want to blame the nurse or the nurses or whoever was providing the care. But tubing, as we know, it looks really similar a lot of times. It's often interchangeable. And nurses are connecting and disconnecting dozens each day. Another example are the Quaid twins, who were born in 2007. And after being admitted to the NICU, they were given 2 adult doses of heparin, which is 1,000 times stronger than Heplock, which they were supposed to receive. Because the nurse failed to detect the dosage on the bottle, the infants received 10,000 units rather than 10 units. And this turned their blood to the consistency of water. These twins were saved, but earlier that same year, there were 3 babies in Indianapolis who died from the same mix-up. And again, the nurses are responsible, but we have to take into account all the cases that they're involved in and the number of unique doses they're administering during the day. We need to rely on the design of products to minimize the chance of fatal errors like this. This report is now nearly 20 years old, but it estimates that there are 44 to 98,000 preventable hospital deaths in the US each year. On the high end, that's equivalent to a Boeing 747 crashing once a day for nearly 3 months. So this problem, this issue is not foreign to FDA, and they're definitely aware of it. And they recognized the benefits of applying things like human factors to the design of medical equipment for many years. In 2000, CDRH released this guidance document describing how human factors should be incorporated into risk management. Over the next 10 years, the human factors group was established within FDA, and so did the demand on medical device manufacturers to provide evidence of a human factors process in their application for PMAs and 510Ks and so on. So 11 years later, in 2011, this human factors committee within CDRH published the human factors draft guidance, which described the agency's expectations for presenting evidence of adherence to a human factors process. For many people in the medical device industry, this represents the time when human factors became relevant as part of the regulatory process. 5 years later, FDA published the current human factors guidance in 2016, and this document clarifies many of the steps manufacturers must complete when preparing their submission in regards to human factors. And in under 50 pages, it describes how manufacturers should implement human factors into their risk management and how to prepare and conduct a validation usability study. So there's a lot of very, very kind of prescriptive approach to implementing human factors in this draft guidance. So in general terms, my job is to simplify things. And so I couldn't help myself but to try to simplify this human factors process laid out by FDA in the guidance. And I should say myself, but this really is a team effort, so it's not just me. But this kind of three-step process we put into an infographic, and we tried to kind of make it as simple to digest as possible. And so throughout the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to provide a description of how to successfully perform each of these three steps. So step one is to identify device users, the user interface components, the use environments, known issues, and critical tasks. So at this point, it's really just a lot of what do we have, who do we design this for, what do we know? It's a bunch of identification steps. And the first being the identifying the device users. And this step is really vitally important and helpful when thinking about how the device should be designed. So if we look at the pictures here, we would probably design a product much differently for the healthcare professional on the left compared to the elderly woman on the right. We'll talk about reasons why. So when thinking about the users, I find it helpful to ask a series of questions. And so we'll ask things like who purchases the device, who sets it up, who uses the device. Often there's many people using a device at different times for different reasons. Who cleans or reprocesses the device, who disposes of the device. So all of these questions will help to identify the amount of users that are potentially involved in using this device. If you think about something like reprocessing, which is a fancy word for cleaning, this sometimes doesn't get addressed until very late in the design process. And the engineers, the design team, they're really focused on making the device usable, desirable for the users, but sometimes fail to take into account the fact that someone's going to have to clean this device and sterilize it and make sure that it's clean for the next patient. And reprocessing obviously is very important because if it's not done correctly, it can lead to catastrophic outcomes. So designing a product to meet the needs of those who will reprocess it may increase the likelihood of it being done correctly. So kind of taking into account each user early on in design. Next, a second set of questions can help identify each of the user's characteristics, abilities, and limitations. So these questions should be asked of each user group that's identified from the questions on the left. So we'll ask questions like, what are their physical and cognitive limitations? What about their level of education? Do they have any type of specialized training? What is their emotional state when using the device? Are they in a state of panic because the device is only used in an emergency? Thinking about an EpiPen or defibrillator. These are things that, what is the user, a user who might be, really sound of mind most of the time in this situation when they're panicked, how can we design the device so it can be used in that moment? So after identifying the users, we want to take into account or make note of all of the user interface components. And this seems like a very simple thing, but often we find that people don't take into account all of the different things that are part of the user interface. So the user interface really is anything that the user comes in contact with or interacts with. So this includes things like packaging, training, the instructions for use, labeling, and then of course the buttons, knobs, levers, and pedals, and then the graphical user interface, which often these days is a touch screen. But I think user interface, people usually think of the graphical interface side, but it really is anything that the user comes in contact with. And by identifying those, it helps to think about how they should be designed with the user in mind. Instead of waiting till the very end to put some instructions together, thinking about what are all the tasks that users need to complete, and then designing instructions early in the process. Next, the device's use environment should greatly influence many aspects of its design. A simple example would be different design considerations for a device used in surgery versus one used at home. Not only would the aesthetics likely be different, but the manufacturer should probably take into account the characteristics of each environment. So what is the lighting like? How about the ambient noise? How much space do users have? Is there any other type of equipment they have in the room or in the environment that they also use? So all these questions can help to kind of think through the environment that the user's in and then influence how the device can be designed. The next step is to identify any known use-related hazards. And this is really kind of some secondary research that could be about the device that is currently on the market. So maybe we're working on version 2.0. And so we want to look at what are the use issues out there that have occurred for device 1. It could be competitive devices or predicate devices that are identified in the 510K. So really finding all those, and what FDA is trying to do here is they're trying to make sure that the known issues are accounted for, and so we're not making the same mistakes. So if predicate device A has this certain thing that causes people all sorts of problems, they don't want our new device to incur those same problems. These are some examples of where some of this information can be found, and this is provided in the guidance document. The last part of identify is probably the most difficult and takes the most time, and it's identifying the critical tasks. So this is done by first identifying all the tasks that the user will take to complete use of the device. So this includes, unpacking it, setting it up, using it, taking it down, storing it. So really from start to finish, what is involved in use of the device. And we'll notice that not all tasks are created equal. So some tasks are much more important than others. And it's most important, or what we call the most important tasks are the critical tasks. And critical tasks are defined as those that, if not performed correctly, would lead to harm to the patient or user. And so that's simple enough, but it's important to note that harm can also mean a delay or lack of therapy. So failure to perform one of these critical tasks is what we call a use error. And notice that it's not called a user error. One of the commandments of human factors is blame not thy user. So in no way or never will you see a human factors report calling something a user error, because we don't attribute the blame to the user. We attribute it to the device itself, and we think of ways that the interface can be designed to minimize task failures through good design. So an example of an easily identifiable critical task, because I think we get asked this a lot, how to define critical tasks, and It's something that we end up going back and forth on quite a bit with manufacturers. And so I'll give a couple examples. First one here is Syncardia Systems Total Artificial Heart. So in the event of complete heart failure, the Syncardia Total Artificial Heart can be implanted in place of the two ventricles and serve as a bridge to transplant. Air from this external driver on the left is pumped into the heart through drive lines. So in the event that the external driver fails or malfunctions, the patient must be detached from the faulty driver and connected to the new driver. If you're imagining what's happening here, you're probably right. So this must be done quickly, because as soon as the drive lines are disconnected from the external driver, the artificial heart stops and the patient's blood stops circulating. So this must be done quickly, it must be done accurately, and it's done under a lot of stress. So like I said, this is a pretty easily identifiable critical task. Another example would be something like this. So in this picture, we see that the injection from this device is supposed to be done at a 90-degree angle, so basically straight into the skin. And then this is important because sometimes healthcare professionals with other devices are injecting at some sort of an angle. And so for this one, we know we're supposed to go straight in. And the question is it critical if this is done correctly? And maybe, the answer is truly maybe. It depends on how important it is that the full dose be delivered, and possible outcomes of not doing this at a 90-degree angle. So for some drugs, it might not be critical, but for others, it could be a matter of life or death, because not doing it at a 90-degree angle would mean the dose is not fully injected, or the patient's not getting a full dose. And so it's important to look at each task individually and determine the potential outcome if it's not performed correctly. So moving on from identify, we move into what we call a formative usability process. And when thinking about how to name this, I think we batted a few ideas around, but what it truly is, a formative usability process, is really simply design, evaluate, and repeat. So the only way to know if things are being developed correctly and can be used by users is to actually get them in the hands of those users. This iterative approach can actually save a lot of time and money. So the key is to perform small formative usability evaluations while the product is being developed. So rather than waiting until the entire device is ready to go, you evaluate individual components as they become available. As you can imagine, it's much easier to implement the changes that are found when the design is pliable in an early prototype form. And so, an example of this would be if you had a device with, a graphical user interface and, of course, a package that goes around it. You've got different groups working on different pieces. And so while the engineers are working on the mechanics that go into the internal components, maybe the design team can create the information architecture for the graphical user interface and put that, on a computer or a tablet, and just take that around and get feedback on the flow and the information architecture to see if it matches users' expectations. And so that being done at the time when the mechanical stuff is being done, you're really saving time because you're not getting to the very end and then finding out that your graphical user interface doesn't make any sense to people. You've done that kind of in step with the other parts of the process. And there are multiple research methods that can be used to obtain this user input that can fit the need at that time. So one thing we can do is bring people in for an interview, talk about their tasks. We can show them models or even drawings of things that could be designed, get their feedback, and really, leverage their knowledge about the field to understand how things should be designed. We could visit users to observe them in their natural habitats. So kind of some observation. contextual research, go out and really see what it's like to be a user performing these tasks. So maybe they're not using the device you're designing, but maybe they're using other devices, kind of similar devices, and you can really see what they deal with, even talk to them about the struggles they have with the current devices on the market, and gain some insight into what should be designed. And then, of course, we can always do usability testing once we have some sort of product. So we can have people come in and use, like I mentioned before, the graphical user interface, have them kind of perform tasks and learn through usability testing. And this would be done kind of in a simulated use setting, how users would perform with the device that's being made. The cool thing about these formative studies is we don't need that many participants. We usually recommend including 5 to 7 users, depending on what we're trying to find out at that time. And we expect to find a majority of issues with just that small number of people. And since we know that successful performance of the critical task is ultimately what will determine the device's standing with FDA, we focus early on designing and evaluating those. So we want to make sure we are confident that users can perform those tasks first. It's also a good time to get valuable feedback about users' needs and desires. So we have them there to evaluate a product, but while we have them, we're paying them for their time. We might as well ask them other questions too. We can learn all sorts of things. Maybe there's another product that's in the works that we can kind of start asking them about. We can learn things for marketing, branding. We can learn about competitive products. I mean, these people are doing this stuff every day. They are the experts in their field. So having them come in and just trying to learn as much from them is really helpful. And then lastly, this sometimes gets overlooked, but we can use the formative studies to prepare for the validation study. So some tasks are difficult to simulate. In the validation study, as we'll talk about next, we need to simulate as closely as possible the environment of use and kind of the context of use. And sometimes that's pretty difficult. It might require props or mannequins, special codes to trigger events, or even actors or confederates to kind of play along and act the part. And so working out these kinks in the formative testing really helps to make sure that the validation study goes off without a hitch. So kind of perfecting the method. This is a picture of the Grand Canyon, it's the reason I have this here is that formative testing is something that I feel like we're always trying to encourage people to perform because we see the benefits of it. And what's funny is once done, people also, the manufacturer really almost every time they see the value in this formative evaluation because they realize how much we can gain from just a small commitment to the number of users and the fidelity of the project. And so I liken this to kind of crossing the Grand Canyon. If you try to go from design over here on the left and jump across the Grand Canyon in one step and get through your validation and submit to FDA and have it be approved, it's like trying to jump across the Grand Canyon. And we know what would happen if you tried to jump across and you didn't make it. You end up falling down this hole, and then climbing back out is way harder than just starting from the other side. And so, I thought this might be a visual representation of how formative studies really are important in kind of building that bridge that would help get across. And by the time we get to the validation study, we don't think there's any risk in falling and not making it through, that we truly are ready to then submit the submission to FDA. All right, so step 3, the thing that usually gets talked about the most is the validation usability testing. So the goal of validation usability testing is to demonstrate that the device can be used without serious use errors. Simple enough. And the characteristics include that the device be the final design. So like I talked about with formative testing, we can do this with prototype devices, early designs. We really can, use anything to evaluate in the formative. In the validation study, we have to have the final device that will be eventually on the market. And the problem with this is that if everything doesn't go well in the validation study and we can't demonstrate the device can be used without serious use errors, we now have a device that is tooled, completely designed, locked, and it's really, really hard to make any changes, sometimes impossible. And so the amount of control we have over making the changes at this point are very little. And so that's the reason for valid or formative evaluations earlier on in the process. So validation testing, one characteristic, it has to be the final device, final design. We make all interface elements available. And so what that means is that anything that the user would have, they will have in the study. So anything that comes in the packaging, any associated accessories that would come with the device, the instructions for use, they have all of them. What they don't have are any accessories that are purchased as kind of additional things. So if your device comes standard with one set of things, and then they have the option of buying pieces A, B, and C, they don't get A, B, and C because not everyone who purchases the device gets those. They get what they would get if they buy the device. So as a part of the user interface, the training would also be provided. So if your device users receive any sort of training, then that would happen in the validation study or before the validation study. And it's important to make sure that we allocate enough time for the training to what we call decay. So basically, if your users are not expected to receive training and then use the device right away, then we would need to set up some sort of time for them to kind of be trained and then go away. Maybe it's this can be as short as an hour in some cases, but it could be much longer. It could be a day, it could be a week. It really depends on how soon after training your users would usually be using the device. In validation testing, 15 representative users is the minimum that we need to include per group. And like I said, that's the minimum. It could be more depending on the device and certain situations, but 15 is the minimum. And the other important thing to note here is that's per group. So if your device has physicians, nurses, techs, all these different groups are unique, and so we need to have 15 users of each of those groups. And likewise, they would perform the tasks that are representative of their role in that procedure. So nurses will perform the nurse tasks, physicians the physician tasks, and so on. In the validation usability test, we must test all critical tasks. So in that identify stage where we've identified our critical tasks, we have to show that the users, again, can demonstrate a proper use of all critical tasks. And this can get sometimes pretty complicated because some tasks, I'll get into this. So some tasks are really difficult to simulate, like I mentioned. And what we try to do as much as possible is create a realistic simulated use scenario. So rather than telling the user, we need you to perform this task, we set up some sort of scenario that represents what they might experience in real life. So if this was a home use device and the patient would, let's say, use it for treatment a few times a day, we would kind of walk them through and set up a scenario where we're kind of putting them in the position of being, at home and going through different activities, so that it's more like kind of realistic to what they would do. If we just give them the task, it's not very realistic and kind of gets messy. In fact, usability studies can be messy sometimes because people say, well, this isn't real. We're not really injecting anything. And so there's a real kind of science and kind of method to making this realistic, even though it's not. I like this one, no leading the witness. I think I stole this from Bob North, but really it's not leading the participant. What that means is that we need to ask questions, present scenarios in a way that doesn't provide the answer to the actual task. And so that pertains to the task they're currently performing and then future tasks. So in a validation study, the study moderator would present the scenario and the objective, what the user is expected to do, and then basically they step back and they let the user use the device as they see fit. I mentioned I had it on a slide. I didn't talk about it, but it's the shut up rule. So at this point, we are not telling them a thing. We don't give them any input as to how they're performing. As a moderator, we need to be careful to not give any cues with our body language or anything like that. It's very important to just stay out of the way and let them use the device. And that can be really tricky sometimes, as many of you probably know from your experience, when someone is just going down a path that's incredibly wrong, to just sit there and act as if they're doing it perfectly correctly. But it's definitely an important part, because that will then get at, let them use it as they see fit, and we can really obtain those data. So mentioning data, there's 3 different types of data that we collect in a validation study. The first is observation of participant performance. So this would be their ability to perform the task. And we score this in a way that says, either they passed it easily, maybe they had some difficulties, or they had a use error or failed the task. And of course, as I'll mention later on, we're taking all sorts of notes during this time to make sure that we know exactly what is going on, kind of hopefully getting at why they're having this difficulty or what's leading to this use error. For those tasks that we can't simulate, we call these a knowledge task, and we want to make sure they comprehend these. So a lot of times these are things like contraindications or warnings that are critically important that the user know and understand, but it's really difficult or impossible to simulate that and have them go through some scenario where we'll actually be able to assess their comprehension of that. And so it's perfectly fine to do all of the observation of those performance tasks and then sit down with the participant and go through their comprehension of the contraindications and warnings, or other things that can't be simulated. And again, we don't want to lead them. We want to make sure the question is very neutral and allow them to answer in the way that makes sense to them. And then lastly, we collect qualitative interview responses. And what we're doing here is kind of getting at how easy or difficult it was to perform a task. And what we can learn sometimes is that they had some difficulties that we couldn't observe. So maybe in one of the tasks that they were performing, it seemed like they were just flying through it and everything made sense. But we get to this part where we're asking them how easy that step was, and they mark it as a difficult task. And then we talk about it and they say, well, yeah, I was looking at the instructions and, I thought they were telling me to, do this, but then I realized that I was supposed to do this. And so it kind of creates that dialogue where we can understand if they were having any issues that we didn't observe. And all of these data, once collected, end up in a validation usability report. And the kind of meat and potatoes or highlight of that report is this analysis of the performance tasks. So basically the critical tasks. And this, the guidance provides a table that lists what we need to provide for each of those tasks in order to kind of report the performance by the participant. So we list the task, we list the use error or difficulties, and we even list it out by participant. So we'll call out, participant 12. And we do this because it helps us to be able to go back into our notes or go back into maybe the video that was taken and re-watch that should there be questions about this particular use error difficulty. After that, we write up the observation and follow-up. So what was observed, what did the participants say? And then when we followed up later, which we do after failure of it, or at the very end, what did they say about that task? What was it that confused them? And that is really important for the next cell, which is the potential root cause. Ultimately, what we want to get out of this is the root cause of the use error or difficulty, because that is what we can link back to the device to determine how it can be designed differently to mitigate this problem. And so understanding if this was something that maybe the device didn't make clear in the instructions, maybe the button that they were supposed to press felt like they were pressing it, but it wasn't actually being pressed, or maybe it was too small for their finger to get to. We want to know, we have to know the root cause of the use error so that we can then figure out how to change the design. In this table as well, we talk about the clinical consequence, potential harm, and that's really to kind of link it back to the risk assessment to determine how risky this task was. And then if there was a risk control and if we need to do a redesign. And the real goal of validation usability testing is to get to this part and have this table be as empty as possible. And the only way we've seen that be done is through regular formative usability studies. Typically, when we come straight to a validation, this table ends up with quite a bit of things like this, and we then have to write about them, and the manufacturer has to decide what they're going to do to mitigate the risk. And it truly is a much simpler process if we've done some sort of formative work before, where we have found kind of the low-hanging fruit before getting to this step. All right, so imagining that you've done all of you need to do to submit your device and you're now on the market, what's next? So it's important to continue to look at how your device is being used on the market. Passing validation, usability testing doesn't mean your device is perfect. With only 15 users or 30 or 45, there might be some things that weren't encountered, or maybe when it gets in the real world, there's some things that come up. So you should continue to monitor your critical incident reports for issues related to usability, and then potentially conduct field visits. So go out, observe users using the device in its real context. I mean, there's, like we talked about earlier, there's great value in that. Likewise, talk to the actual users in the field, and then create a design wish list for version 2.0 and beyond. So it might not be that the things that we learn in these observations or in the surveillance we can implement right away, but all those can go into designing a better product the next time around. So in summary, human factors is a study of the interaction between humans and their products, services, environments, etc. The goal of medical device human factors is to improve safety, first and foremost. And then FDA requires medical device manufacturers to demonstrate their device can be used safely and effectively through a validation usability test. And then surveillance of post-market issues will help ensure the device is safe and desirable. And the human factors process for medical device design can be broken into 3 main steps. First, identify the users, the environments, interfaces, known issues, and critical tasks. Perform a formative usability or process, or carry it out. So designing, evaluating, redesigning. This iterative approach will help kind of flush out some of those design issues. And then lastly, validation testing, where our goal is to prove the device can be used safely and effectively by its users. That's all I've got. Thank you for attending.
Brian, that was plenty. Don't dismiss it as that's all you got. Oh my goodness! And thank you so much. Every time I talk to you, I learn a little bit of something about the topic of human factors, and today was certainly no exception to that. We do have a few questions, so let me get where I can view this. First question, and folks, please do chime in with your questions if you do have some. We'll get to as many of those today as we can. Any additional questions, we'll make sure Bryant and the team at Research Collective gets those questions, and I'm sure they'll be following up with you in the next several days or so. Yes, the most common question that we always have at the end of these, yes, it is recorded. This whole session has been recorded. Yes, the slides, the recording, all of that will be made available to you. You'll get that in your inbox probably later today. If not today, it'll be tomorrow morning. And yes, it will live forever and ever on the Greenlight Guru website as well as within the next couple of days. So yes, it's coming your way. All right, so the first question comes from William. William states the 510K clearance process is based on substantial equivalence to a predicate device. How does substantial equivalence affect how much HFE must occur?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in reality, if you're showing substantial equivalence, it doesn't necessarily mean that the tasks that the user will perform with your device are the same or even close to the same as they are in the predicate device. So I think, if there's a way that you can show certain tasks are basically the same, in every way, you can try that, but we've never seen that really be successful. It's really, any little nuance causes the user to think about things differently. And so it's ultimately important to identify the critical tasks, and with your device, they're going to be slightly different than the predicate device most likely. And so you'll need to show proof that those critical tasks can be performed correctly.
All right. Next question. Leo is asking, how closely does the FDA final human factors guidance align to IEC 62366 and 62366-1?
Great question. They align quite well, actually. We were just at an event with the FDA folks and some people who represent the IEC side as well. And they are definitely in agreement. In a lot of ways, they're sometimes the same people. And the human factors process is truly, like I talked about, it's not new, it's not unique to FDA. And so if you follow a sound human factors approach, you're likely, actually I'll say you will, meet the requirements of any of the regulatory bodies.
All right, good. So next question comes from Fady, and Fady asks, the FDA MAUDE database provides lessons learned for medical device companies, but it does not include much information for combinations product. Where would that data reside? Brian, I don't know if you have insights to that question or not.
Yeah, I don't actually. I think, no, I don't really know where that would be found specifically.
Yeah, I would expect, Fady, and I can double check on this, but I would expect that combination products, any adverse events for those devices, I would also expect to be in the MAUDE database. If you want, send me a note at Greenlight Guru, and I'd be happy to investigate that a little bit further. Maybe there's something about your question I'm not fully understanding, so feel free to reach out to me. All right, so Brian, the next question comes from Scott. Scott states, we used to call formative testing, quote, verification. One of the big challenges is that users say they want blue whistles and red bells, but when you do the blind testing, they wanted green side rails and chrome wheels. Any advice on how to structure the pre-designed questions to drill past user preconceptions?
A great question. So I think it's always really important to start with the research questions for any study, and those will then define the method and the structure of the study. And so if we're, if we're trying to, we actually just ran into this with a study we're doing, so I'll kind of give an example from that. We went out early on, and there's a device on the market now, and they wanted us to collect feedback from their current users to kind of understand what the next device should be designed like. And in this case, I think like what you're talking about, there's no device, there's nothing for them to kind of point to. And so they're all over the place with some of their responses. Some people want it to be this shape, other people want it to be this size, other people want it to be this weight. And so we collect all those data, and we then try to take what we think is converging, so look for the things that come together from multiple people, and put that then into a really, really rough conceptual prototype or model, and get that back into the hands of users as quickly as possible. And so if they said, they wanted, like you mentioned, the blue button or something, we get that right back out there, and then learn, hey, you know what, it's not actually what they wanted. Now that they see something, what they really want is this. And so we haven't put a ton of time into making it exactly what they said they wanted when they didn't have anything to compare it to. We do, again, really quick, take their feedback, get it right back out to them, and get their kind of continued feedback and refine that. And so in our example, we're now through 3 different studies like that, where we've improved the models, taken their feedback, gone out and done this 3 different times, and we are very, very confident that what we have now is exactly what the majority of people are looking for, and we're testing its usability and all of that.
Okay. All right. So Brian, here's a fun question, I'll say, from Mike. And Mike asked, should users be required to read the directions for use prior to participating in the human factors study? For example, should reading the DFU be part of the inclusion/exclusion criteria in the study design?
That is a fun one. So the quick answer is no. So in a validation study, okay, let me back up. In a formative study, you can do whatever you want. If you want to evaluate those instructions, absolutely have them read them, have them follow them step by step. By doing that, you're actually evaluating their understanding of the instructions themselves. But when it comes time for your validation study, you absolutely cannot have them read the instructions. You can't make them read the instructions, because there's no way that when that device lands in their office in the real world or at their house, that you can force them to read the instructions. And so kind of mirroring that realistic simulated use scenario, it is exactly as it would be if they didn't have us there with them. So so the answer is yes in some cases. So formative studies, if you want to learn if the instructions make sense, absolutely, we definitely recommend that. But when you're at the point of validation, those people are using the device in the way they want. If they want to read the instructions, they absolutely are welcome to. If they don't want to read them, they do not have to.
Right. I mean, I'm with you. I think sometimes we put a lot of CYA verbiage and language in DFUs and instructions and operator manuals and things like that, and that's kind of defeats the purpose of good human factors. And if you don't know what CYA means, I'm sure Google will have a good answer for you folks. But all right, so next question comes from JD, and JD asks, it's kind of a specific question, so hopefully this makes sense. Does the soak time during testing have to match that of the soak time between training in the use of device and actual use, or can manufacturers justify a 1 hour soak time suggested in the guidance? No, for this instance, the worst case would be a user could go for months without using the device. So using the worst case scenario for a test soak time would create an entire year-long usability study, which would be impractical. That's a pretty specific question. I don't know if that's too specific to apply and kind of a general response, or if that's something that makes sense to reach out to JD one-on-one?
Yeah, it might. I'll take a stab at it, and then of course, JD, my email's up here, Bryant@Research-Collective. Definitely happy to talk more about this, but I think I get it enough to answer, or at least make an attempt at it. So the reality is, in all our conversations with the FDA Human Factors Committee, they understand the constraints that we're all under, and the manufacturers are under, and so they don't need us to do anything that's above and beyond what's practical. If you can make the argument that an hour decay time between training and the study is representative of what you might expect in the field, then absolutely go right ahead. If you think it's maybe a day, do that as well. What we always recommend is getting FDA involved early and often. So I've heard John and Mike Drews talk about this as well. Like, treat the FDA as kind of a partner in this. It's their duty to help get these devices that are going to help people's lives and save their lives onto the market. And so, engage them. We always recommend submitting the validation usability protocol ahead of the study, well in advance, to get their feedback. And it helps with things like that. So if we have said in there, hey, we think an hour decay is appropriate, and this is why, it gives FDA a chance to say, well, we think based on the way your device is used in the field that, you should go with something more like a 3-hour decay. And we know that ahead of time, and we don't have to run into the uncomfortable situation where we've done an hour decay time, we ran the study, and then we've submitted results, and FDA says, ooh, you really should have thought about that decay time.
All right, so JD, if you have additional insights that you're hoping to dive into, do reach out to Bryant directly. I just want to let our audience know we are right at that 1 hour point. Bryant has agreed to stick around for a few moments additionally, and there are a few more questions, so we'll get to a few more of those. If you have to bow out and move on to the rest of your day, totally get it. Thank you for participation. David shares this was a great webinar, very informative and great speaker. Tom says, wow, this was really helpful. Jerry says you love the content and the information. So folks, even if it's to tell Bryant thank you, send him a note. I'm sure he would love to hear that. But Bryant, we're going to ask a few more questions if that's okay with you.
That sounds great.
All right, so let's go to Donna. Has a good question. Donna is asking, should human factors be completed or conducted for all class devices?
Great question. And the answer is, why not? If, like I talked about, so I guess I'll back up a little. It's definitely required for most devices, if not all. I can't think of any that it wouldn't be. But if it's a new device, if it's a new product that has, a new way of interacting with it, the users are going to have to use that. And so, whether it's as rigorous as you would perform for a class 3, life-sustaining artificial heart, maybe not, but I think it's still worthwhile to put this in front of the users, get their feedback, and have them perform, basically show evidence that they can use your device effectively.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. All right, next question comes from James. James asks, if the user group that we identified does not have any critical task, does that mean no final validation with that user group is not required? All right, so it's a little confusing. Hopefully you made sense of the question.
Yeah, so if there's no critical tasks for a user group, do they not need to be included in the final validation? I think that's something that I would feel most comfortable presenting to FDA. We've definitely tested products that have no critical tasks at all, so class 1 type devices, and they have come to us after submitting their documents to FDA, and FDA has asked for human factors results. And so I think that's something that, again, is just really important to kind of get their feedback on, understand their expectations, because my guess is that if it's part of the process, somehow they're involved, and FDA would want data around those tasks.
Okay, good. So Michael has a question, and this is a kind of interesting one, I think, too. How does human factor testing differ for devices used by trained medical professionals, such as surgeons, versus devices used by patients, like in a home use setting?
So, obviously the setting changes, the types of tasks they're performing are much different, but the general objective and goal of the study remains the same. So we would identify the tasks that the let's say the surgeon, for example, would be performing, and in the environment that's representative of what they work in, we would have them perform those tasks. So this might be, a surgical suite. We've done studies where, we've had things like fluoroscopy in order to evaluate vascular surgical devices, and they're actually, putting this, using this device to perform some sort of simulated procedure with a model. And so obviously those studies can be kind of more involved. For home use, again, what is the environment? How do we simulate that? If a device is to be used while the person is, on the couch, then we probably wouldn't have them seated at a table or standing up during the study. So really, just kind of, they're very different, because of the different contexts, but they're the same in that we really try to identify how is this person going to use it, how is this person going to use it, and simulate those settings.
All right, great. So I'm going to combine a couple questions. Both John and Niall, and I hope I'm saying everyone's name correctly, so my apologies if I do not, are asking variations of this question. Basically, it's where does the N equals 15 in the human factors guidance come from? Are there situations where you may require more or less than 15 representative users?
So the N of 15 comes from work that Faulkner has done recently, and it points to the number of usability issues that can be identified by a certain sample of the population. And so at 15, it's expected that, over 90 to 95% of the usability issues will be encountered. And so the FDA has chosen that number, again, kind of something that they figure is realistic, that's doable, without, obviously if we wanted to find 100 or 100% of the issues, we could possibly include more users, but 15 is kind of the number they've come up with. I've never seen an instance where they have permitted less than 15 for a user group, except if there are tasks that are the same for various user groups. So, for example, if we had physicians and nurses, and those are our two user groups, but the tasks they perform are the same, it's possible you could, and again, this would be something you'd have to present to them and kind of make your argument. They would ultimately rule on it. But you could say, what if we included 20 users, 10 of each group, and kind of mix them, but go above that 15 total. But since they're doing the same exact tasks, maybe we can get away with less. We've seen that work, but again, that's kind of a case-by-case basis.
All right. Well, Brian, I know and thank you so much for sticking around for a few minutes later. There are still quite a few questions that are out there. Some of them I'm kind of anxious to potentially tag team and help respond to you a few things about design controls and usability and human factors. But folks, if you did ask a question, we'll make sure that those get to Bryant and the team at Research Collective, and I'm sure that give him a few days, but I'm sure he'll reach out to you and contact you. I guess I just put you on the hook, Brian. Hopefully that's okay.
Absolutely, yeah. I look forward to them.
All right. And again, folks, I want to thank Bryant Foster and all the hard work that he and the team at Research Collective have put in today's presentation. Bryant, thank you so much. And folks, as always, I encourage you to submit your ideas for future training sessions and webinars. Just go to www.greenlight.guru. You can submit your ideas and suggestions to us there. And of course, if you're in the med device industry and you need to streamline and improve your quality management system, and you'd like to just focus on your efficiency, including workflows around design controls, which, yes, the secret answer is yes, there is a relationship between design controls and human factors.